There is a grain growing in shallow water across this continent. It is not rice, it is a grass with nearly twice the protein of white rice and 15 times the antioxidant activity. Indigenous peoples built civilizations around it. Then someone patented it, and the people who protected it for centuries could not afford to eat it. And by the end of this video, you will know how to grow it in your own backyard. Compare it to the white rice sitting in your pantry right now. That white rice was milled, stripped of its bran, stripped of its germ, then enriched with synthetic vitamins because the processing removed the real ones. The grain we are talking about today needs none of that. In its natural, unprocessed state, it delivers more protein per calorie than almost any grain on Earth, second only to oats. A single cooked cup provides more than 20% of your daily manganese, more than 15% of your zinc, and meaningful amounts of magnesium and phosphorus and folate and B vitamins. It has a lower glycemic index than white rice. It is naturally gluten-free, and it costs nothing to grow if you know where to put it. Here on Garden Explained with Harry, we dig into the plants the modern world forgot. This one might be the most deliberately forgotten of them all. A grain with these numbers should be on every shelf in every grocery store in the country. It is not. And the reason has nothing to do with nutrition. The grain is wild rice. But that name is a lie that was given to it by people who did not understand what they were looking at. Wild rice is not rice. It is not even closely related to the white or brown rice you buy in bags at the store. It belongs to a completely different genus called Zizania. 4 species of tall aquatic grass, 3 native to North America and 1 native to Asia. It is one of only 2 grains that originated on this continent. Minnesota designated it the official state grain, and it is almost certainly the most misunderstood food crop in the modern world. You may have seen it before, a dark, slender grain mixed into a holiday side dish at Thanksgiving, tucked into a small plastic bag with a gourmet label and a price that makes you put it back on the shelf. You probably assumed it was a specialty product, a luxury ingredient meant for expensive restaurants and magazine recipes. That is exactly what they want you to think. The Ojibwe people have a different name for it. They call it Me Nu Min. It means the good seed. And the story of how this seed went from the foundation of an entire civilization to a forgotten novelty item on the top shelf of your grocery store is one of the most deliberate erasures in agricultural history. According to Ojibwe oral history, the Anishinaabe people were guided westward by a prophecy. The prophecy told them to travel until they found the place where food grows on water. They walked for generations from the Atlantic coast through the forests of the Great Lakes and into the wetlands of what is now Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan and Ontario. And there, in the shallow lakes surrounded by birch and pine, they found it, a tall grass rising 10 feet above the waterline. Heavy seed heads bending toward the still dark water, food growing on water. Exactly as the prophecy described, this was not a minor food source. This was the center of everything. The Menominee people were named after this grain. Their name literally means the wild rice people. The Ojibwe named their September moon after the harvest Manumanik Gisis, the rice-making moon. The Dakota harvested it, the Cree harvested it, the Ho-Chunk and the Ponca and the Meskwaki harvested it. Nations across the Great Lakes organized their entire annual calendars around the ripening of this single grass, and they fought over it. For more than a century, the Ojibwe and the Sioux battled for control of the wild rice lakes in Wisconsin. Nearly 500 warriors were killed at Mole Lake in 1806. This was not a weed growing in a ditch. This was not a garnish. This was a grain worth dying for. The harvest method itself was elegant in a way modern agriculture has never matched. Two people in a birch bark canoe. One paddled slowly through the rice beds. The other used two carved wooden sticks called knockers to bend the ripe seed heads over the gunnel and tap the grain loose. The seeds that fell into the water sank to the bottom and became next year's crop. The seeds that fell into the canoe became this year's food, the same plant feeding itself and feeding the people at the same time. No planting required, no irrigation, no fertilizer, just a canoe and two sticks and a grain that had been doing this on its own for thousands of years before any human arrived. Then the 20th century arrived. Researchers at the University of Minnesota decided that the Ojibwe way of harvesting was inefficient. That was the word they used. In the 1950s, a plant scientist named Irvin Oelke launched a domestication program. He collected germplasm from 24 natural wild rice stands scattered across the state. These stands grew on lakes that the Ojibwe had treaty rights to. Nobody asked the Ojibwe for permission. Nobody consulted them at all. The researchers took their samples and brought them back to the university greenhouse. What they did next changed everything. They bred the shattering out of the plant. In natural populations, the seed heads shatter when they ripen. That is how the grain reseeds itself year after year. Seeds fall into the water. They sink into the mud. They germinate the following spring. This mechanism is the reason wild rice survived for millennia as a permanent, self-sustaining food source. The university looked at that mechanism and called it a flaw. Shattering meant lost yield. Seeds falling into the water were seeds that could not be sold. So they engineered varieties with thick stems and tight seed heads that held their grain until a mechanical combine could come through and strip them clean. They turned a self-perpetuating food source into a product that needed to be replanted. A man named James Godward had served in Burma during World War II. He watched white rice farmers in Asia growing paddies in flat, flooded fields and came home to Minnesota with an idea. Why not do the same thing with wild rice? Level the land, flood the field, harvest with machines. By 1968, Minnesota had 900 acres of paddy wild rice. By 1973, it had 18,000. Production exploded and the price collapsed. The wholesale cost dropped from $4.44 per pound in 1967 to $2.68 in 1976. The Ojibwe hand harvesters could not compete with combines. The canoes sat on the shore. The knocker sticks gathered dust in sheds. The traditional economy that had sustained communities around lakes for generations was priced out of existence by the same institution that had taken the germplasm without asking. And then it got worse. In 1999, a California corporation called NorCal obtained a patent on a wild rice breeding process. In the year 2000, researchers at the University of Minnesota mapped the wild rice genome. This cleared the road for genetic modification of the grain. The Ojibwe were not consulted during the patenting process. They were not consulted during the genome mapping. They learned about it the same way everyone else did, after it was already done. The patented varieties included a trait called cytoplasmic genetic male sterility. That is a scientific way of saying the grain cannot reproduce. Uros. Sterile seed. The Ojibwe recognized this immediately for what it was. The same principle behind Terminator seed technology. A grain that had been feeding itself and its people for millennia was now engineered to depend entirely on the company that held the patent. When the Ojibwe pushed for legal protection in Minnesota, the biotech industry sent representatives to testify against them. A spokesperson from Monsanto argued that protecting wild rice from genetic engineering would send a chilling message to the entire biotech industry. A corporation worth billions was telling a state legislature not to protect the most ancient grain on the continent, and there was the contamination risk that nobody wanted to talk about. Researchers found that pollen from test plots drifted at least 2 miles, maybe further. The engineered pollen could cross with wild populations growing in natural lakes. The grain that had been reseeding itself without human intervention since before the last ice age was now at risk of being permanently altered by genes designed in a laboratory. Meanwhile, the California paddy rice industry packaged their product with images of canoes on quiet lakes, selling a factory-farmed grain wrapped in the visual language of the culture it had displaced. But the Ojibwe did not accept this quietly. In 2018, the White Earth Nation did something that had almost never been done in American law. They granted legal personhood to Manoomin itself, not to the harvest, not to the tradition, to the plant. The grain received the right to exist, the right to flourish, the right to be protected from destruction. 3 years later, in August of 2021, the tribe went to court. They filed a lawsuit on behalf of wild rice against the Enbridge Line 3 oil sands pipeline cutting through northern Minnesota wetlands. The pipeline threatened the water table. The water sustained the rice beds sustained the people. That chain was not a metaphor. It was the oldest agricultural relationship on this continent. Despite years of legal battles and public advocacy, the Ojibwe still do not have binding federal protection for their grain. The state grain of Minnesota remains legally vulnerable to the industries that profit from replacing it. And this is not just an American story. On the other side of the Pacific Ocean, the fourth species of wild rice once blanketed the wetlands of China, Zizania latifolia, Manchurian wild rice. Chinese records of collecting and eating this grain stretch back more than 3,000 years to the Zhou dynasty. The grain was so common and so deeply woven into daily life that one of the most widespread Chinese surnames derives from it, the surname Jiang. Hundreds of millions of people alive today carry a family name rooted in a grain they have never tasted. Something strange happened to the Chinese species over the centuries. A smut fungus called Ustilago esculenta infected the plants and caused the stems to swell into thick, fleshy, edible galls. Farmers discovered that the swollen stems tasted wonderful. Gradually, they stopped growing the plant for grain and started cultivating it for the stems instead. That vegetable is called jiaobai. You can find it in wet markets across East and Southeast Asia today, but the grain itself disappeared as population pressure rose during the Tang and Song dynasties. Rice paddies and wheat fields expanded into every available wetland. The wild rice habitat shrank until the grain harvest vanished entirely from the region. 2 continents, 2 different mechanisms, same result. On one side, corporate agriculture took the grain, and on the other side, expanding conventional farming pushed it out. The grass that fed itself was replaced everywhere by grasses that feed the system. The research that does exist on wild rice tells a story the grain industry would rather you not hear. The core research findings are clear and consistent. Studies have shown that compounds in wild rice reduce the buildup of plaque in cardiovascular tissue. The grain lowers harmful lipid levels. It contains substances that improve insulin sensitivity and reduce chronic inflammation. Its phytosterol levels run several times higher than white rice. Those same phytosterols are the active ingredients in cholesterol supplements that sell for premium prices at pharmacies. Phytosterols matter here. The antioxidant gap is not subtle, 10 to 15 times higher than white rice. That is not a minor nutritional edge. That is an entirely different category of food. Antioxidant differences like that change the conversation. Now follow the money and the full picture comes into focus. Money explains a lot. Minnesota is the largest producer of cultivated wild rice in the United States. In 2023, the entire industry produced just over 10 million pounds. The total economic contribution was $58 million, spread across 30 farms in the entire state. California is the only other state that grows it commercially. Compare that to the global rice market, hundreds of billions of dollars every year. White rice dominates because white rice keeps the machine running. It requires annual seed purchases, fertilizer, pesticides, irrigation infrastructure, processing plants, distribution networks. Every link in the chain generates revenue for someone. Wild rice in its natural state reseeds itself every fall. The seed heads shatter and the grain drops into the water and sinks into the mud. It germinates on its own the following spring. No replanting, no seed cost. In established beds, the plant can drop up to 1,000 pounds of seed per acre back into the water before anyone harvests a single grain. The plant is literally giving its future away for free. Self-perpetuating is the operative word. A self-perpetuating food source generates zero recurring revenue. Zero recurring revenue attracts zero corporate investment. Zero corporate investment means zero shelf space. And zero shelf space means 3 generations of Americans grow up thinking wild rice is a luxury side dish instead of the most historically important grain on their continent. Zero is the bottom line. Now here is what they do not teach you. Wild rice grows in fresh standing water, lakes, ponds, marshes, slow-moving streams. Anywhere you have 6 inches to 3 feet of water over a soft, muddy bottom, the grain thrives in northern climates. USDA hardiness zones 4 and colder are ideal, but growers have had success as far south as central Missouri. You need true wild rice seed, not the processed black grain from the grocery store. That has been parched at high heat and will never germinate. You need raw green seed that has been kept cold and wet since harvest. Several small suppliers sell viable seed online. A few pounds is all you need for a backyard pond. Planting is almost comically simple. Scatter the seed directly into shallow water over a muddy bottom. The good seeds sink and settle into the sediment. They spend the winter dormant in the cold mud. With the first warmth of spring, they send up green shoots. By midsummer, the grass stalks will have climbed 8 to 12 feet above the waterline. By late August or September, the seed heads ripen and turn a deep purple black. Then the shattering begins. Some grain falls into whatever container you hold beneath the seed heads as you bend them over and tap. The rest falls into the water and becomes next year's crop without you lifting a finger. The first year is a gamble. Wild rice is not domesticated and it does not behave like a corn plant or a tomato. Some years, conditions produce a thick, productive stand. Other years, water levels or late frost knock it back. Over 5 years, expect 1 excellent harvest, 1 good one, 2 fair ones, and 1 poor one. But the stand persists. It reseeds itself without help. Seed costs after the first year are 0, and the water benefits too. Wild rice filters excess nutrients from the water column. It stabilizes loose sediment. It reduces algal blooms. It buffers wind across shallow lakes. It creates habitat for ducks and fish and frogs. You are not just planting food, you are rebuilding an ecosystem that was drained and paved over for the last 200 years. Processing the harvest is straightforward. Gather the ripe grain by bending the seed heads over your container and tapping them with a stick. Spread the raw grain on a sheet pan and dry it in a low oven at around 200 degrees Fahrenheit for a few hours. Rub the dried grain between your hands or inside a cloth bag to crack the outer hulls loose. Take it outside on a windy day and pour it slowly from one container to another. The breeze carries away the light chaff. What remains is clean wild rice ready to cook. 1 cup of dry grain, 4 cups of water. Bring it to a boil and then reduce to a low simmer. Cook for about 45 minutes. You will know it is done when the grain split open and the pale interior curls outward like a tiny flower. 1 cup of dry grain becomes 4 cups of cooked grain. Season it simply with salt and butter. Stir it into soups and stews and casseroles. Toss it with roasted vegetables, stuff it into peppers, mix it into cold salads, or eat it plain from the pot with nothing but butter the way people on this continent have eaten it for longer than anyone alive can remember. If you soak it in water overnight, the cooking time drops by nearly half. A people who named their calendar moons after its harvest went to court in 2021, not for themselves, for the grain, because a pipeline threatened the water. And the water was the rice, and the rice was the oldest promise on the continent. That food would grow where the water was still, that it would shatter its own seed into the mud every autumn, that it would come back every spring without being asked. The grain still grows wild in the lakes of Minnesota and Wisconsin and Ontario. It still shatters, it still sinks, it still germinates without permission when the ice melts. 30 farms in one state produce it commercially. Meanwhile, it spreads on its own across thousands of square miles of shallow water, asking for nothing. It does not need a Paddy, it does not need a patent, it does not need a corporation or a university to tell it how to grow. It grows where the food floats, where it has always been. Oh, and if longevity fascinates you, my friend runs a channel called The Centenarian's Garden, all about Blue Zone secrets and what actually helps people live past 100. Go check them out, you won't regret it.